It's a beautiful morning here. It is midwinter, but here in the subtropics it's still an okay time to open the hive because it's not too cold in this location. If you're in a southern location here in Australia, then it would be too cold to open your hive. But what we're going to do today is check in on this hive here. It has had a few problems. It lost its queen actually a couple of times, which sometimes happens with a beehive. And then the hive next to it can go on with no issues for all year. So it's always good to have a few hives. If you have issues with one, you've always got another one bringing in the honey. So the first thing we're going to do is give the hive a little bit of smoke. And we've already got our smoker going, blowing nice, cool smoke. And we can just put a little bit of smoke up under the screen bottom board. Or you can do it in the entrance, up to you. We're going to place this near the entrance so the hive just gets those wisps of smoke, and it just helps to keep them nice and calm as you open the hive. Make sure you protect yourself from stings if you're new to beekeeping. Wear your gloves as well. I'm just doing up the jacket here and making sure that these two, that first of all this zip is done up, and then these two zips are also up, and then there's a cover that goes over the top. Next I'm going to grab the J tool, which also has a chisel at the end. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. I'm here to help you answer all your questions and hopefully help you on your way as you get started in the fascinating world of beekeeping. Okay, so there's an excluder in between these two boxes, which is sized so the queen doesn't go and lay eggs in your flow frames. Now, we can choose to either go above or below the excluder. Sometimes you've got to work it out a little bit as you go to see which way it's going to come off easier. So I'm going above it in this case. You can use this as a nice strong handle. Now if you look in here, you can see there's not a whole lot of honey in this hive yet. They're just starting to put some in the middle in the last inspection, but we're not seeing it in the window yet. So it should be nice and light. Then there's a handle on the other side. And what I'm going to do is just pick up that box and put it aside, just like that. I've already prepared a spot to put it. It's nice to keep it up off the ground so you don't squash any bees that are underneath. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below and we'll answer them as we go. Here we are. Now we're looking at the excluder and we're going to peel that excluder off just by getting the tool underneath and lifting slowly, trying not to jerk it. Sometimes it can't be helped. Now the queen could be on the underside of the excluder. I'm just spotting some beautiful pollen there. You can see on the hind legs those big yellow pollen balls. It's a beautiful thing. So the queen could be on the underside here because now we're into the brood box below the excluder. So I'm having a quick scan, not to be confused with drones. You can see that bigger bee there, and its eyes are big and touch in the middle compared to the workers, which have the smaller eyes. Now I'm just having a look for the queen, looking for her long pointy abdomen. If you missed our queen spotting videos, you can dial back a couple in our live streams and you can see Hilary Kearney's queen spotting and tips and tricks on how to find her even when it's tricky. Okay, what we're going to do is just rest that up against the hive just in case we've actually missed spotting the queen. She could always just crawl back into the entrance there. Now I'm having a look at this brood nest, wondering which frame to pull out first. The idea of today is to have a look in, check that the queen is laying and everything's happy and healthy for the spring to come. The spring here is not far away at all. It comes quite early in August, and we're expecting this hive to really do well, assuming the queen right it's called, when the queen's laying well and everything's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is choose a frame to pull out. Now, I'm looking across them, having a look for burr comb and things that are joining the frames together, trying to find one that's easy to get out first, because it's that first one that is more challenging. I'm also going to show you a little trick here of putting these little shelf brackets onto the hive, which can form a frame rest. So you can just wind out a couple of screws on the side of your hive and put them on like that, and then you've got a spot to rest your frames when you pull them out. Okay, so I'm going to choose this frame here, I think it is. I think there's one here that actually is just being drawn out still. So I'm going to come across a little bit by putting the tool in between them and just levering them apart. If I add just a wisp of smoke to either end where we're working, then you'll get a bit less bee activity there and less likely to squash any bees. So let's have a look when we pull that frame up. We're gently coming up. Okay. Now, what's happening on that frame? They're rebuilding it, which is nice. So that's a frame we actually cut the honeycomb out of and put the frame back in. And you can see them rebuilding it. Now, interesting thing to note, they're building it with old wax, not with new wax. So with the absence of a nectar flow at the moment, they're actually choosing just to recycle wax inside the hive to rebuild this frame. As soon as the nectar flow starts and there's a whole lot of new bees producing fresh new wax, then they'll start to fill out this frame with quite white wax. Any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll keep answering them. Now, I'm not seeing any signs of brood or anything on that frame, so it's unlikely the queen is on there, but I'll have a look anyway. We don't necessarily have to find the queen. We're looking for signs of eggs or larvae, baby larvae, to know that the queen's doing her job and everything's good. So I'm just going to slide that down and rest it on the shelf bracket there. Okay, next frame.
Cedar, we've got a question from Eric. He's asking, do you think adding an ideal super above the single 8-frame brood box could help with swarm control before he adds the super for the main nectar flow?
Okay, so the question is, should he add another box? And in this case, he's talking a small box, they say this high and ideal, which is not as deep as this deep, and filling that first before putting the flow frames on. Now, I would suggest putting the flow frames on top first, just to get the bees going and working on that sooner. If you start adding other boxes, it'll take a while for you to get activity on your flow frames, which might be a little bit frustrating. But once you've put your flow frames on and they're starting to fill them, then you could go ahead and add another box. But your question's about swarm control. Now, I think that the best method for swarm control is actually to split and start another hive. It's always good to have another hive. If you don't want it, somebody else certainly will. However, if you don't want another hive and you don't want to take a split, then yes, adding more boxes will help with swarm control, because it's the overcrowding of the hive which is the primary trigger of swarming. The next one is space to lay eggs. So if you don't want to add another box and you don't want the hive to swarm, then what you'll need to do is actually take some honeycomb out from the edges and put, you can either just, if you're using naturally drawn comb, you can just cut the comb out in the field and move those frames in towards the centre, perhaps in positions here and here. Not right near the edge again, but in opening up the brood nest, and that's it. The next trigger is there space for the queen to lay eggs. So yeah, there's a few ideas there, but you can add boxes if you want, but I would actually wait until you've got some activity on your flow frames first. Okay, so I'm just pulling this frame out, and what I'm seeing is a whole lot of glistening nectar here, which is a really good sign the bees are starting to find some nectar. So spring is starting here. It's a beautiful thing. And over here we've also got brood. Now a little bit hard to see because there's so many bees on this frame, but under here where my finger is, you've got capped brood, showing the bees are in their last 11 days of their larvae style. Spend 11 days in larvae and and 11 days in the cocoon phase, which is where they're capped in, going through their metamorphosis, growing their wings, and that amazing change from a grub to a bee. Okay.
Danny's asking if the flow hives on Amazon are ours.
Okay, so we do have some flow hives on Amazon, but the best place to go for flow hives is our website. Reason being is there's a whole lot of scammers and fakers out there who actually take people's money but don't deliver. There's endless problems. You might have seen the advertisements coming through, and it's gotten to the point where there's even scammers scamming the scammers. Like, it's actually completely ridiculous, but it's part of our world out there. Please don't fall into the trap of buying counterfeits that have a whole lot of issues or may not even arrive. So yeah, Amazon isn't the best place, although we do have a genuine listing of our flow frames on Amazon too, for those who love to buy through Amazon. But it can be hard to tell because there's a lot of counterfeits stealing our images and so on.
Sandra's asking, how much bigger is the queen?
So the queen is about a third longer. Her abdomen is pointy, and you'll see that her wings, they come sort of more halfway down her body. So we'll see if we can find her, but I'll have to tune in on queen finding to do that. Here's a queen cup just there, which is, if the bees want to raise a queen, they could use that cell to raise a new queen. Which you get a lot of that in springtime. It's a natural thing for the bees, raising swarm cells or supersedure cells to make sure they have the ability to raise a new queen. Okay. I'm not seeing the queen on that frame. So I'm going to put this frame here and get another one.
Sally noticed on the last video that some of the wax was noticeably darker, and it seemed odd to her that it was such a new hive. Is there a difference between the recycled wax within the hive and newly made beeswax?
Absolutely. So the newly made beeswax is white, and sometimes yellow depending on what they're bringing in, but it's sort of a bright brilliance to it. And then the really old wax is brown or almost black. So that's the scope, and you get everything in between as well. So beekeepers, when it gets really brown and almost black and it's been in there for typically a couple of seasons, they'll tend to start rotating it out by moving those dark frames towards the edge. Wait till there's no brood in it, then you can actually take that out of the hive. You can cut out the comb and enjoy chewing on that, or you could it's up to you what you do. You could crush and strain the honey out of that. But the naturally drawn comb is quite easy. All you have to do is actually shake off the bees, get an oven tray, and cut out that comb, and then you can put the frame straight back in without having to go through that process of rebuilding the frames. Okay, my smoke is just almost out, so we're going to stick a little bit more hay in there from the garden here. There we go.
Danny's asking if you make your own queens for their genetics.
The question is, sorry?
Do you raise your own queen for their genetics?
I don't do any queen raising myself. I rely on queen breeders to do that if I want specific genetics. But we do actually allow the bees to raise their own queens at times as well. So there's a bit of a mix here of purchasing queens off queen breeders and letting them naturally just raise their own.
Ryan's curious when the last time you got stung was.
Okay, the last time I got stung I think was in the Facebook live stream a couple of weeks back, and I actually showed pulling the stinger out. It's a good idea to scratch crossways. It goes through phases, and you get quite complacent, and then you get a few stings, and then you start being more careful again, is how it goes. But I don't react too badly. I get a little bit of swelling, but it's not enough for me to want to wear gloves all the time. But if you were getting bad reactions, you can wear your gloves and be more careful, and you get less stings. Okay, let's levering the frames apart once again. And let's have a look at this one in terms of the wax. So this is a little bit in between. It's not really dark, and it's not fresh either. Interesting here, we've got drone size cells in this area, so quite large cells, upwards of 6 millimeters. Then over here we've got worker size cells, which are around the 5 millimeters, 5.3. So we've got some nice brood there, which is good to see. So this hive's going to have a lot of new babies. There's the queen right here. You can see her longer abdomen. Do we need shade to see that? And come around here a little bit like that. So there she is, just there. And notice the way she's got bigger striding steps. And her wings only come halfway down her body, and she's got a pointy abdomen. But one of the key ways to see her is this shiny back plate. Because she lives a lot longer than the other bees, the hairs wear off on her back plate there. There she goes, down through a little tunnel and across to the other side. Okay, beautiful. So we know we've got a nice healthy queen, we've got some brood, we're not concerned about this hive, so that's good news. It's had a bit of a rough drop, but it looks like it's back in good order, and we should expect this hive to flourish as soon as the nectar flow comes on. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below, and we'll keep answering them.
Benjamin would like to know if anyone has developed a flow hive for Australian native bees.
Okay, so Australian native bees, the ones that he's most likely talking about, are I call them TC bees because it's hard to pronounce the name, but they're basically a little tiny bee that almost looks like a small fly. They don't have stings, so they're stingless, and you can keep them in a small box. We did have a couple over here, but they're not there right now. The issue in terms of creating a system for them for harvesting honey is they don't produce very much at all. So you could only probably harvest half a kilo or a kilogram per year, which doesn't really warrant making a harvesting system. Now, as compared to the European honeybee, which is these ones here, these ones you might be able to harvest upwards of 40 kilograms a year. So it's very, very different in the amount of honey harvesting. The other interesting thing about them is they have this grape-like spiral structure inside, so it's completely different in style inside, but fascinating. If you want to keep native stingless bees, then it's a lovely thing to keep as well. I've got some at home. They don't. There's no issues with keeping both in your backyard.
Alexandra is asking, how long should an inspection last before the bees get annoyed and agitated?
Okay, so that's the thing of just tuning in with your bees. Here we've got a nice warm day, so I'm not concerned about having some frames out of the hive. That'd be the first thing. If it was cold, I wouldn't leave open brood, as in non-capped brood, outside the hive for very long, because they're temperature sensitive. Now, in terms of tuning in with your bees, some hives will get agitated quite quickly, and other ones you can seem to have apart for hours. So it really depends on your hive and the genetics, which sets the temperament, and also the day. If it's a cold, rainy, windy day, they will be more grumpy, a bit like humans. Warm, sunny days, they're more friendly.
Taylor would like to know what kind of bees you keep.
So these bees here are the golden style ones, what gets called Italian bees. So if you're ordering bees from a bee breeder, then when you get these gold looking bees, that's the Italians. If you order Caucasian bees, then they'll be dark without that gold appearance. And there's also Carnolians and a few other types you can order, and they are all said to have different traits. But in actuality, what tends to happen is once the hive replaces its own queen, they'll mate with all sorts of drones from all sorts of hives, and it becomes a bit of a mixture of genetics, and you can have dark bees and light bees in your hive. So it's hard to say we're really keeping one or the other. Good questions.
Cedar, what's the wax on top of the frame that's outside the hive?
Okay, so there's a bit of wax here, well noticed, and the bees will take any space they can, especially if they're running out of space, to start creating wax. So in this case, there's a bit of space between the top bars and the excluder, and they've just started to create some comb there that they'll use for honey storage or brood storage, depending on what they're going to do. It can be a good idea to cut that off to keep it nice and easy to service your hive. But it's up to you. Some people also say that it's nice to leave that there as a reserve for the bees, and the bees will actually grab that piece of wax and recycle it and put it either onto the flow frames above or use it around the hive. So I'm going to put this hive back together now, and what I try to do is remember which order it went in, because what you'll find is the frames have bits of burr comb sticking out, and it's best if they're not touching each other. You don't really want unserviceable pieces of comb between the frames. The reason being is those hive beetles, if they can find a spot that's unpatrolled by the bees, they'll start laying eggs. So it's often interesting to leave a little bit of burr comb so you know which frame goes where as you're putting the hive back together. For an example here, you can see that if I squish this frame up against this one, because this one bulges out and that one bulges out too, all of these bees in between would start to get squashed in between the comb, and it would create this area that wasn't serviceable until the bees chewed it all away and fixed it up. So what the bees are trying to do is create what's called the bee space, where they like about 9mm back to back between adjacent comb surfaces, and about 6mm between the wall and a frame if they're not working back to back. So that's what they're striving for. So when you move frames around, you start to change that, and then they need to go and refix it and reorder it to be those bee spaces, which bee space was really an important discovery in the Langstroth hive that meant that you could service hives and pull frames out and inspect them, which has become a really important thing for managing beehives.
Denny has a pond and lots of dragonflies visit. Are those predators going to be an issue for the bees?
Dragonflies. I haven't heard any issues with dragonflies and bees. Sometimes water dragons, which are a big Australian lizard, will eat bees, but I sort of think fair's fair when you have critters coming to eat bees. We have the rainbow bee eaters come here every now and then and come and eat quite a few bees, but that's what they do, and as long as they're not decimating your colony, then I think it's okay. We also have the cane toads, which are an introduced pest here, which knock on the bees at night, and the bees come out to see what's going on, and then they eat them up. So where you've got issues like that, it's good to get the hives off the ground a little bit, put them up on a stand, or use our flow hive too that's already got the stand, so the cane toads can't quite bang on the entrance at night time. More questions?
Oh, Chuck has a great question. Do you think the bees build some of the burr comb in order to help with the air circulation within the hive?
Okay, I'm not aware of the bees so much trying to control air circulation through put burr comb on the frames. It's more so finding space, and they like to fill in any space they can and make sure they've got the right amount of bee space between things. Air circulation is an interesting and much debated topic in beehives. Some people believe that a screened bottom board is fantastic for bees, and other people don't. Some people say with a non-screened bottom board, you've got an entrance and you'll see the bees fanning in one side and out the other. Others say there's a cycle that happens where the warmth of the hive comes up the middle, and then the moisture-laden air comes down the edges, and the bees will be assisting that fanning motion to dry out their honey and keep the right humidity in the hive. So bees are amazing little air conditioners. It's one of the most fascinating things, is the way they can control so well their climate inside the hive and do all the things they need to do. They're keeping their brood at the perfect temperature, keeping the humidity at the perfect amount in order to dry their honey, but then not get too dry, and so on. Cooling the hive when they collect water, and then use evaporative cooling. Okay, so we're going to then put this last frame back in. If you do need to, you can add a little bit of smoke to where you're working, and it just moves some of the bees away, and you're less likely to squash them. So I'm trying to create that space that is the right amount for that frame to go back in, and then lifting up this frame here, which they're still building on. You can see their amazing effort. They've gone for drone size there, which is either for honey storage, they like to have bigger cells, or perhaps they're gearing up for the spring and they want some cells to put some drones in. I'm just gently dropping that down into the hive and just giving it a gentle push into place. Then what I'm going to do is push the frames together by levering them across like this, so that the bees don't have the wrong bee space between the frames. And like this, what you want to do if there's a hive like this where you've got plenty of space on the edges is move the space to the edges and keep the space between the frames what it's set at. Too much space between the frames, the bees will actually start to double comb and do all sorts of things, and it turns into quite a mess. So that's ready for me to put back on the queen excluder, and we know the queen's in the box because we found her, so I'm not too worried about shaking off any of the bees. and just giving that queen excluder a little clean like that. And put it back in place, and I'm going to seize that moment while there is no bees on the excluder to drop the top box back on, just by picking it up and putting it on top.
Danny's asking, is it the nurse and worker bees that decide to swarm?
Okay, so question about swarming. Now, swarming's a really interesting one, and it highlights the fact that the queen isn't a queen as we think a queen should rule the hive. It's more the queen is somehow subject to a group consciousness inside the hive where the hive as a whole will decide that it's time to divide, and they'll actually starve the queen because she can't feed herself and until she's thin enough to fly, and then they will give her a push out the front of the hive. And you often find times where half the bees will take off but the queen didn't quite go, and they have to come back and get her again. So it's this fascinating thing, and you'll see us catching live swarms hopefully in another month or two, and it's a really fascinating time to tune in on what's going on in that really interesting time of when they're dividing. But there's a fantastic book called Honeybee Democracy, and that goes right into detail about how the bees decide where to go, and their democratic system of deciding on whether to find a new location in a mailbox or in a wall cavity or in another hive or on a tree branch or so on. So fascinating book, Honeybee Democracy, and it talks all about their decision-making practices. Thanks very much for tuning in, and please tune in again next week. No such thing as a silly question, so I'm here to answer your questions to help you get started in this fascinating world of beekeeping.